Okay, Mr. Landis here, lesson 4, week 4, cause of the Civil War, part 2C. So it's our third little video lesson here on part 2. We're going to talk today about a huge, gigantic, enormously important event on the road to the Civil War, and that is a court case. The Supreme Court of the United States is going to settle a case that will launch, I don't say launch, man, almost shove us closer to that kickoff to the Civil War. Here's the question. How did the Dred Scott court decision increase tension between North and South? Remember, the question we're always asking is, how did this wedge get driven into America more and more and more, deeper and deeper and deeper, right? That finally, crack, split us open, right? Dred Scott is another, boom, pounding, right? A huge pounding of that sledgehammer into that wedge. That wedge we know is slavery. This event, boom, pushes it deeper. Okay, answer. Supreme Court ruled, we'll see today, landmark case, that slaves were not only were they not citizens, therefore they couldn't actually be in court, but that a previous decision that kind of bandaged the country together, we'll see in Missouri Compromise, was completely illegal, and therefore slavery was allowed everywhere. Okay, so before we dive into this, a couple things we have to remember about our road to the Civil War. We must remember slave power. Remember, slave power is a secret belief that there's a rich group of Southerners that are manipulating the national government into protecting and expanding slavery. Lincoln will argue this. Many Northerners will. This is a huge part of today, especially when we see a court case. The highest root of power, right, in the government, the Supreme Court, right, the Chief Justice, will see this issue of slave power is going to come up. It's going to be a huge issue today. Also remember our main man, Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Remember, they wanted to build a railroad across America, right? They had to go through the territories, settle them. But what about slavery? Are these going to be slave-free territories? That's a question we're asking. Remember, balance of power in the Congress. He said they can vote on it. We know that led to violence, right? Another example, slave power. Slave power was the reason Douglas was a part of it. He must be, because look what happened. Slavery was into violence caused in Kansas. These are the way that the conspiracy theory goes, right? We must keep this in mind as we look at the pivotal decision today in the Dred Scott case. Okay, Dred Scott, here he is. I'm going to give you a timeline of his life as it relates to his court case. Okay, so here we go. 1830, Dred Scott is sold to a guy named Dr. John Emerson. Okay, so remember, this is way back. The roots go way back. 1830, 1842, Scott travels with his owner to various free states, territories, Illinois, Wisconsin, etc. Now remember, you may recall from expansion, Biddy Mason traveled to free states, California, and her owner tried to move her back to Texas, to slave state, and she sued for her freedom, and she won. Keep that in mind, okay? 1842, Dred Scott's owner, Emerson, returns to St. Louis and dies. Okay, so what does that mean for him? Scott sues for his freedom in the circuit court, right, of the state. Amazing. Guess what? He loses, but he appeals. Remember the appeals process. And guess what? In his appeal, he wins his freedom, 1850. Now, it's not over, because remember, there was always appeals for those. So what happens? His owner, Emerson's wife, right, goes to appeals, goes to the Missouri Supreme Court. They overturn the ruling. He is found, right, to be still in bondage. He appeals right to the U.S. federal court. He loses. And finally, we know the last case, the last place where the highest court of the land is the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's where he appeals. His case appears before Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, 1857. The last chance. Remember, the highest court in the land. Now, you must remember that at the time, it's slave power. Everyone's watching this case. This is a huge case. Can a slave sue for freedom? Does being in a free state mean that you're free? What are the property rights? The nation is watching. And as the nation watches this case unfold, and as they watch the decision come out, it is your textbook calls it bombshells, and it's so true. It is like an earthquake. Right, and a rejoicing for some in the South, and a cringing, weeping / screaming for those in the North. I'm going to read you some parts from Taney's what's called the opinion, the majority opinion. This is what the Supreme Court Justice writes when they're explaining why they ruled the way they did. Here's what he says: "It is too clear for dispute." Wow, big statement. "That the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people," that's a big term here, the people, who framed and adopted this declaration. He's saying that the framers and the founders never intended to include black people in the Declaration of Independence, which not only is, first of all, foreshadowing back, 80 years, 70 years to what they believed. Maybe some of them did, but they never said that in the Declaration, okay? He's saying that it was too clear for dispute. He's saying it is clear. They didn't mean that, which John Green says in his video. That is not true at all, right? We know that Biddy Mason, many people were included and won their freedom declaration, right, and the Constitution. He goes on, the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who have been imported as slaves nor their descendants. So he's saying all African-American slaves, whether they had become free or not. Now he's saying all black people in America were then acknowledged as a part of the people. This is that thing about we the people. He's saying the people did not include black people. Again, that is untrue. That is untrue. Right? It's been proven. Again, we think not just Biddy Mason, all African Americans who have voted, who have owned land, who have had property rights. He's saying those people were never meant to be included, right? Even if they were allowed. And here's the kicker. They slaves were not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens. What? In the Constitution. So he's saying now the Constitution as well. And can therefore, here's the kicker, can claim none of the rights and privileges which the instrument provides, Constitution, for and secures to the citizens of the United States, and therefore are not allowed to sue in its courts. In other words, you were never meant to be part, Dred Scott, of the Declaration or the Constitution, therefore you have no other rights. You can literally not even be here. You have no right to be here. Therefore your case is thrown out. Guys, this is an incredibly huge, gigantic pounding right of that slavery wedge into America, because black people everywhere and Americans everywhere are saying, well, this can't be true. This is patently false from my experience, right? I have citizen rights. My state protects my citizen rights. And yet here we have the Chief Justice saying these things, right? Were not meant to be true, and therefore they cannot be true. Huge, huge. So what does this mean for Dred Scott? He, right, cannot be free. Now, what does this mean for the country? I'm going to show you why this is such a big deal, okay? You may recall that the Missouri Compromise line says, okay, no more slavery above this line, which, by the way, we already broke with the Kansas right Nebraska Act. No more slavery above this line, okay? So Missouri, that's it. No, nobody else, okay? Think about what this does. If slaves are not citizens, right, and if property rights have to be protected and slaves are property, guess what this means? The compromise that said no slavery is allowed in this territory above here, guess what? That compromise has to be unconstitutional. Think about it logically. If slaves aren't people, they're not citizens, according to Taney, then you can take your non-citizens anywhere. You can take your property anywhere. Being in a free state doesn't make you free because there are no free states. Do you get it? This is why this is such a big deal. That's why it's such a bombshell. The Missouri Compromise has essentially just been declared null and void. The whole Band-Aid for keeping the nation together as we went west is gone, is blown up. Look what happens. This is a new map, slowly faded over. Look what happens. Slavery is allowed everywhere. All of this territory is slavery is allowed, right? There can be no slave or free states. It's all slave. This is what Emerson was referring to in the last lesson, and what Lincoln will later say. We must be all slave, we must be all free. Does that make sense? This is why this decision is such a huge, gigantic bombshell in the country, because it essentially rewrote about 70 to 80 years of common law, and it dropped the bombshell of the worth of African Americans and their future, and the rest of the expansion projection. What was occurring? Slavery everywhere. Now think about the reaction. Southerners react how? Yeah, we know it. Northerners scream, cry. Guess what they cry? Slave power. Taney, he's part of it. He's in on it. He's the leader of it, right? He's been bought. He's been bribed. You know, they found dirt on him and all this. Slave power. Okay, how could you not believe it? Again, Taney himself wasn't even a proponent of slavery. He had freed the slaves. Your textbook went over this. How else could he have come to this decision to expand slavery west unless he was part of the slave power conspiracy? He must. See, this is how conspiracy theories work. You find evidence to support it, and people believed it. All right? So, our question, how did the court case increase tension? How did it drive that wedge deeper and deeper? Because it ruled that slaves were not citizens and that all of America is open to slavery in the West. And this exploded the minds of Northerners who were freaking out, trying to keep this nation together. Although all along we knew this dividing line couldn't work, right? Slave and free. And it puts the jeopardy of expansion and America right in question. Because now we just resolved the question. Can slavery and freedom coexist? We said, we're coming to the conclusion, well, not really. And the highest court in the land just said, yeah, it's all kind of open to slavery. So there you go. What do you think about that? This is the beauty of the road to the Civil War. We are coming to a point where we must decide this question of ethics and morality with the issue of owning another human being. Okay? The fulfillment of all men are created equal is going to happen. And we're coming to that cliff edge, guys. We're walking up to it, right? We're taking these sometimes a giant leap or a giant shove or sometimes a crawl, and we're almost there. We're saying, we've got to solve this. We've got to answer this question. And as a nation increasingly approaches that point in their consciousness, we are approaching the war itself. So finally, we'll see South Carolina will say, yeah, we don't want to be part of a country that we think is going to get rid of slavery. We're out. And that is the Civil War, which we'll get to soon.